What is going on, everyone? Just getting things started here, so let's get this rolling. All right. Looks like I'm live. Let me give it a minute here and just kind of see if others are going to pop in before I actually get started with anything. What's going on, everyone? If you're just joining, I'm just going to give it a minute or two and see if other folks hop on before I kind of start getting into the mix here. How's everybody doing? All right. Looks like we've got a few more people that have hopped on. So we'll go ahead and just get started. First of all, hope you are all doing excellent on this Friday. Yeah. So just to kind of quickly call out two things. One, I'm on like a 15-ish second delay. It's the lowest latency that I could get with all my configuring. So if I'm able to figure out how to get it even lower for future streams, I'll do that. But there is a bit of a delay, about 12 to 15 seconds. So if you leave a comment, just know it's going to be a few seconds before I see it, but I'm monitoring them, and I'll respond to any comments that you have. If I'm in the middle of demonstrating something, like walking through how I mixed a certain thing and showing audio samples, I'll circle back on your comments. So just please keep them coming in the chat, and then I will circle back. But also, the second thing I want to call out is I have shared the multi-tracks for this entire session. You can see there's a pinned comment. I also put a link in the description of this video. So feel free to download those, drop them into your DAW of choice, and mix it yourself. We're going to be walking through how I mixed it here, so you can use some of the techniques I'm going to show you, or just use your own techniques and just kind of see what kind of mixes you can get with it. And it's always useful to practice, right? Like always, if you have a chance to download multi-tracks from somewhere, do it just to practice. So with that, I'll just go ahead and play this back so you can hear it. And then we'll go from there. We'll kind of do a top-down approach, starting with the master bus, going down from there. So one other thing I want to call out before I play this back is this is the Bogren Digital December Riff Contest audio sample that you may or may not have heard either on Instagram or on the Bogren Digital announcement YouTube video. It's the little part where you see me playing the guitar in there. This is using a MIDI version of the drums that I wrote out myself so that I could mix it more kind of how I wanted it to sound. But then there's also one additional part that I've added in here since that audio sample went out. So it's only about a minute and a half. I'm going to play this back, and then we'll get started on just kind of like dissecting this mix. All right, so that's the session, and you have all the multi-tracks for that. So now let's go ahead and just kind of walk through how I mixed everything. And like I said, I'm going to start with a top-down approach because that's how I tend to approach mixing in general, is just kind of a top-down approach. So the very first thing is the master bus, or is possibly more commonly referred to as the 2 bus. So from here, the only thing I have on this active right now is the limiter that I'm using, and this comes from Plugin Alliance. This is the Brainworks BX Limiter True Peak. There's a lot to go over with this particular plugin, so I'm not going to go into super detail into how each individual plugin that I'm going to show you in this video works, because this would be like a 6-hour, 8-hour live stream. But I will obviously reference where I got it and where you can find more information, and that's specifically for this one, it's Plugin Alliance. So you can read all about this on Plugin Alliance, but this is a True Peak limiter, and this is just kind of giving me that volume that I'm looking for, right? The LUFS, which I think I'm kind of targeting around -8 LUFS, something like that. So I'll play this back with it on, and then I'll bypass it so you can hear what it's doing. But all you're gonna really hear is the volume kind of drop. Let me move to a section where you can actually just hear everything back here. So yeah, there you go. It's a fantastic limiter. It's got all kinds of nice features and graphics in here, and stuff to help you identify potential issues in your mix, like the balance and the correlation being some of them. And then of course how you can solo the left or the right channels, or the mid or the side content. So all that's pretty handy. The other thing that I have in here that's not active right now, but I use in every single mix that I do, is again from Plugin Alliance. It's the Adapter Audio AB, Metric AB, and this is for referencing. You can, I don't know if you can read the text on here, it might be kind of small, but if you can, you can see some of the references that I have in here. I'm not going to play back any of them because obviously this video will then get hit with a copyright strike, and I don't want that. But I'll just kind of play this back so you can see some of the graphical interfaces that I tend to use in here. And so one of those, probably the two that I use the most, are the spectrum analysis and the stereo image. Just kind of calling out here real quick, this kind of top end stuff that you're seeing here is coming from a couple of the plugins that are actually adding like saturation. So you can ignore that. Like when I bounce it, it's not really there. Except for like when the audio is playing back, so just kind of disregard that for now. But I'll play this back so you can see my mix is on the top, and then the reference mix is on the bottom. And then I think for this particular one, it doesn't come in for a second, but you'll see it when it comes in. So that's how you can quickly compare, your mix to a reference mix. And what's also nice about this is you can actually dial in to like solo specific frequency bands. So you can do high, mid, low, bass, and sub content. So like for example, I'll do the bass. If you're on headphones, you may not hear a whole lot, but I'll play this back and you can listen. So like you can hear that's just the bass content, and then the same thing with the low mids. And then you can also grab these bars and just drag them around so you can really kind of hone in on the areas that maybe you're hearing something in your reference mix in a particular frequency band range, and you want to see if that same thing exists, if that same feeling or sound or whatever exists in your mix in the same frequency range, so you can do that really easily. Let me make sure I reset these. All right, and then the other one is the stereo image. This one I use a lot on the overall mix, but also on individual tracks. Specifically things like the bass. So if you haven't seen my stereo imaging trick video. It's on the channel. Go check that out. I go over that in detail and how I kind of expand the sound of the bass and other tracks with that trick. And so I use this correlation, the stereo imaging a lot to kind of see how that's affecting the signal. But I'll just blaze back real quick so you can see what it looks like. So the things you want to call out here or notice here are below about 100 hertz, 90 hertz or so. The stereo image is much more contained and isolated to the mid content, and that's how it really should be. And you can see in the reference mix I'm using here, it's very much the same. And that's because that's where all of your driving force, all that low end of your mix comes from. So you really want that contained into the center and just driving the whole mix forward. And then as it goes up, you get into the guitars and synths and some of the higher end stuff and the drums and vocals. All of that kind of starts to expand out to the sides. So that's my master bus. Again, I'm monitoring for questions. So if you all have any questions along the way, drop those in the chat and then I will respond. But again, do remember that there's about a 15-second delay. Going down from there, I have a main bus. Now, I'll just go ahead and kind of talk about how I've got some routing going on here. So I have a main bus, and below that I have a pre-main. Now, the way that I route things is some of the tracks I want to go through my pre-main, which the pre-main then routes into the main, and then main goes out to master. So some of the stuff like the drums, the bass, even the synths, those are all routing into the main, but the guitars I send directly into the main bus, so they're bypassing the pre-main because there's some processing being done on the pre-main that I don't want to have happen to the guitars. So that's just a bit about how I have this routed. And then, so in the master bus, in the main bus, the very first thing here is I have the Shadow Hills mastering compressor Class A. This is again from Plugin Alliance. I have yet to find a compressor that works better than this one on a full mix like this. And that's for a couple reasons. The first being, this is essentially kind of like two compressors in one. It has this optical compressor on the top and then a VCA style compressor on the bottom. And so the way that I've found that really works well for my mixes is to dial in around a max of like 1 dB of gain reduction in the optical compressor. And so it's essentially kind of like a balancing that's happening. And so if there are any super like harsh transients or spikes anywhere in the mix that are coming through, that just kind of pulls those back a little bit and just kind of glues everything across the entire mix together. And then I go into the VCA, and you'll notice that I have a fairly fast attack and release happening here. And that is because the sound that I was looking for, particularly in this mix, is a really punchy like drum sound. And so I'll bypass this, and you can actually hear that like my kick and especially the snare drum are much louder than the other instruments in the mix. I say much, it's not like you're not going to be able to hear anything else. It is a little bit louder than the rest of the mix, and that's on purpose so that when it hits this VCA compressor with this fairly fast attack and release, it ducks that pretty quickly, and it kind of chops off a little bit of that transient. And so I get much more of a punchy snare sound than just a harsh transient. So I'll play this back, and then I'll bypass it, and then listen specifically to the drums, how they kind of get louder, but they lose that punch. I mean, it's night and day, really. So you can hear how the drum and the kick and the snare especially are still loud when I bypass it, but you lose all that like really great punch from kind of rounding off that transient with this fast attack. So that's I just love this compressor. So again, this is Plugin Alliance if you want to read more about all the different features in this thing. And then the last thing I'll call out here is on the bottom the very bottom of this, I am pulling back the volume a little bit, just to kind of add a little bit more headroom before it goes into the limiter, just to make sure I'm not clipping anything. Filtering the high pass. This is a sidechain high pass, so that it's filtering out anything below 150 hertz before it goes into any of the compression, so that like none of the super low, if there's anything super low and boomy, like that's not triggering a massive duck in compression. And then the mono maker I have at 97 hertz, which is just anything at 97 hertz and down will remain mono, and will not be affected by this here, which is the stereo width, which I have up to 100. Whoops, I moved it. It was at like 129, I think. So this is just kind of helping expand the width of the overall mix a little bit. And then those are the last things there. Now going into the Slate Digital Virtual Mix Rack, the only thing I have on here is a Neve 1073 emulation, preamp emulation, the FG73, with about 25 dB or so on the virtual drive. So it's not doing a whole lot. I can literally bypass this, and most people are just gonna not hear anything. But this, I just like this. It's a very, very, very subtle thing that adds just a little bit more analog, flavor or character to the overall mix. And then so the only thing I'm doing here is just essentially a brick wall at like 21 kilohertz, because anything above that is just ridiculous for an overall mix, and it's just going to sound harsh. So this is essentially just kind of chopping off anything above that point before it goes into the limiter. And that's literally it. So that is the main bus. I still don't see any questions, so I'll just keep moving. So again, thinking about the routing, what goes into the main bus? It's the pre-main routes into the main bus, as well as maybe like my guitars. So here is pre-main. And what we're doing here is, this is where I tend to do quite a bit of like the kind of the top-down mixing approach. So you're going to see a few things here. It will seem maybe a little bit crazy, but it works, right? So if it works, then I'm going to do it. And so what I mean about maybe a little bit crazy is, you're going to see I'm adding a ton of air and top end to the mix here, and just a touch of kind of low end bump here as well. But this is really what breathes life into the overall mix, is the stuff that routes through this pre-main. And so the very first thing here up is I have this analog style compression, again from Plugin Alliance, the AMEC. What is this thing called? I don't see it on the screen. AMEC EQ 200. And really, I could probably just disengage these three, because all I tend to use are the high EQ and the low. And you can see I'm bumping 1 dB at like about 69 hertz. And then I'm bumping a pretty good bit, 9.8 dB at 14.2 kilohertz. And so this is adding just a touch of low end and some air to the mix. And so that's the very first thing. And then from there, we're going into this mag compressor, which also has a parallel equalizer built in. This is doing basically nothing on the compression. It's dialed in so small that if there are any, like, again, kind of real harsh, strong transients that poke through, this will duck those just a very, very tiny bit, like a half a dB. But the main reason this is here is for this absolutely amazing airband in this parallel EQ. And that's, I mean, you see here, like the kilohertz setting on this. This thing has a 40 kilohertz setting, and you think, well, you've got a brick wall limiter cutting everything off above 21 kilohertz on your main. So what's the purpose of 40? And the purpose in that is this has a very, very long taper. So you think about this as like a shelf, right? So how kind of a shelf kind of tapers off before it flattens out again. This thing is extremely wide. The taper on this is extremely wide. So even at 40 kilohertz, it's still bringing up stuff, you know, all the way down to 10 and 8K, and it's still helping bring up some of that stuff. So that's why I use this here. And so it's not dialed in super heavy. It's at 3.5 dB is what I'm bringing up. And again, at 40K. So it's going to just bring up a touch of that air. Okay, I see a question. I'll come right back to that in just 1 second. And then the last thing I'll point out is I think I'm doing just like a half a dB on the lows as well. So this is just, again, kind of adding just a very small touch of lows and some air. And so I'll play this back and I'll bypass this plugin, and just you're gonna have to really kind of listen to like maybe the cymbals, just the really upper end air of the mix to hear this, but it's there. It's just it's a subtle amount. So again, it's there. I can hear it like with these decent headphones on, but again, it's a subtle thing. But what I'll do is I'll go ahead and turn this up so you can hear just how good this air band sounds, especially even when it's at 40 kilohertz. But it's gonna get too harsh, but you can hear it. So you can really hear, especially in those cymbals, how like the top end air of those just kind of got super crisp there. So that is what's going on here. All right, so the question, which plugins of your main bus you let active when start to mixing? Yeah, good question. Because as I mentioned before, I tend to follow more of like a top-down approach. I usually start with some similar settings to what you see here on the Shadow Hills. This is, again, back on my main bus. I usually start with similar settings to this, maybe not so high on the optical threshold. It just depends, you know, as I'm mixing later, I'll kind of tweak this and kind of as I'm going, I'll kind of make some slight adjustments here. So maybe if I want more punch, I'll actually pull the attack even further down. Or if I want to let some of that transient through, I'll push the attack back. It just, again, it depends on the mix. And because of this mix and the way this mix sounded, I really wanted just some good, hard, smacky, like punch from those drums. So I pulled up the attack and the release there. But it's fairly similar to this from the get-go. I'll leave the virtual mix rack on here again because this isn't doing much of anything other than just kind of like analog character. And then I'll leave this on here too, this kind of like brick wall at like 20 kilohertz. And then for the pre-mains, I will leave on this right here, basically with these exact settings. Just adding some air and low end to the overall mix. The mag I actually added after I was basically all done with everything, just to kind of see what the airband would do here. And I really, really liked the result, so I left this. But this was something that I added basically when I was already done with everything and just kind of was circling back, just kind of playing with some stuff. So this doesn't usually start on the mix. The black box. All right, this is the next thing up. Anyways, this is on every single mix by default. And it's basically these settings almost all the time, just because I found that they work really well. And it's in mid-side mode, so the top is mid and the bottom is sides. And really the only differences between the two, you can see they're both on the flat EQ setting, so it's essentially affecting the entire mix. The only real differences I'll call out is I'm adding a bit more saturation on the sides, and then I'm pushing the pentode a little bit harder and adding a bit more air on the sides. And as a result of the more saturation and the additional like pushing of the pentode, the volume increases, especially when you add more air. Like the overall volume is going to increase. So I pulled that back a little bit as opposed to the mids where I left them. So that is the black box. And this is a saturation plugin. It comes from Plugin Alliance. And this just kind of helps beef up your entire mix and add perceived volume because of the saturation and all the harmonics that are happening there. So I'll play this back, and you can hear the difference and how, like, when I disable this and add it back, how, like, when I disable it, it kind of, you'll hear the perceived volume drop, but also the like the I don't even know the word I'm looking for, almost like the life of the mix kind of falls out a bit. See if you can hear any of that. So there you go. Again, I have the headphones on. I can clearly hear, kind of like that perceived volume drop there, and I just love the way it sounds with that saturation in there, just kind of adding those harmonics and adding that perceived volume and just kind of size to the overall mix. So that one is on. Just going back to your question, that one is on as soon as I start a mix as well. This is another one. The Slate Digital Fresh Air. So again, this is from Slate Digital, and this is a free plugin. You can just go to their website and download this right now for free. And this is one that's on all of my mixes as well. And the settings I usually start with. Yeah, I'm just noticing the comment that saturation brings life to the entire mix. It really does. I can't say enough good things about the black box like that. It's amazing, and it goes on every single one of my mixes. So the next thing, like I was saying, the Slate Digital Fresh Air free plugin, absolutely free. So go download it right now. It's amazing. And this is not just like a standard EQ where you kind of pick a frequency and turn up the gain, and then the top end gets louder. This is I forget the name of the algorithm that they're using here, but it's a dynamic algorithm that it's almost like how, if you're familiar with Soothe 2, how that pulls out harsh frequencies. This is almost like the opposite. It figures out those good frequencies to boost, and boosts them in a dynamic way that helps breathe air and life into your mix. And I'm telling you, when I bypass this, your head's going to explode because you're going to hear how, like, all the life and the top end and the clarity of the mix just completely falls out. And the way that I typically start my mixes with this is around 5 on the mid and 15 on the high. So not too drastic here. It's just adding a little bit of air to the overall mix. And then as I'm kind of going and trying to tweak things, kind of in the final stages, and especially when I'm referencing. So I'll start referencing and realize the references have a lot more top end and air in the mix than mine. So I'll start dialing it up. And I think I just had this at about 26 and 4. I think that's where I had it. So I'm gonna play this back, and I'll bypass it so you can hear the difference. So you can hear like how over the entire mix, you hear it in the snare, you hear it in the cymbals, like everything. It really kind of brings everything to life, and I just love the sound of it. Especially on even the snare, how it almost sounds like it adds more of like the bottom, like a bottom mic. Like with the snare rings, like the actual snares themselves on the bottom, how they kind of sizzle. It just kind of adds some of that to the snare, so it just sounds so good. And that is on, like I said, from the get-go. And then this one here, this Pro Q3, this is just here for monitoring, basically, just so that I can see what's happening in the mix as I make updates to the plugins in front of it. So I'm in Pro Tools here. So like as I click on different plugins, there's only ever one window open. So what I'll do here is I'll hold Shift and click on Pro Q, which is just kind of like a locked window. And I'll just kind of drag it up to the side. And then I'll pull up these other ones and just kind of start making changes to it and just kind of tweaking things, just so that I can kind of have a visual of also what's happening here. And it's not that, and so I want to be clear, I'm not trying to say that I mix to a visual graphical EQ. I'm obviously listening to it as well. But sometimes, like when I'm kind of seeing if there's any sort of like mids or anything like that I could potentially bring up, I want to see in that area as well. It's just something I like to do. Let's see. Hey, I just see Silvio dropped in. How you doing, man? Thanks for joining. Let's see. So where was I? The Pro Q. Okay. See, again, this is just kind of like a visual for. It's not doing anything. It's just so that I can see what's happening. All right. So that's the master, the main, and the pre-main. So this is the stereo width bus. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but I have a video on my channel. I forget the name of it, but it's something like the secret to huge mixes or something like that. And that video is literally all about this bus. So I'm just kind of going to burn through this real fast because you can see a much more in-depth, in detail overview of what's happening here in that video. But basically what this is it's a high pass at 165 hertz here, and that's only affecting the mid. So it's high passing the mid content, which is, again, as I mentioned earlier, kind of where all the low end of your mix is. So on the sides, you don't typically have a whole lot of low end, but like your kick drum, your bass drum, your tom, low end of your toms, different things like that. That's all basically, for the most part, right up the middle. So I'm just high passing and just cutting out some of that low end from the mid content before it goes into the reverb, which is what's next. And this is using the Slate Digital Verb Suite Classics. You can see the settings I have here. And so this is using a reverb called Empty Closet. And if you're not familiar with this reverb, this is what's called a convolution reverb. And what that means is it's using impulse responses for its reverb. So if you're familiar with what impulse responses are, they're basically like a digital capture of an entire room with the signal chain and everything involved in it. And that includes like whatever mic was used to capture it, the preamp, the room's kind of reverby sound itself. So this was obviously a capture of an empty closet. Now, why the hell am I using a reverb called Empty Closet? It's because I wanted a reverb that has a short decay. And as you can see here, like I have a decay knob so I can still pull it down further if I wanted to, but from the get-go, this started at a low decay. So only 210 milliseconds is what this is at, which is fairly short. Because this is not meant to add like a room, like echo. This is literally just meant to expand the width of the sound, and you can see I have the width of the reverb here all the way maxed out. So I think I can solo this. Maybe we'll hear something. I don't even remember if I've done this before. I'll try and solo this and see if we can just listen to what's coming through this, but it may not work. We'll see. Nah. All right, so forget that. I think I figured out a way to solo it in the video I mentioned earlier, so you can go check that out. And like I said, there's a lot more detail on this bus and how I put this together there. But one way I can kind of show you what this does is playing back my bass, because I think the thing I have going through this the most is my bass. There's a little bit of drums, a little bit of the synths going through here, but the bass is the biggest difference here. So I'll play this back and then I'll mute the stereo width bus, and you should be able to easily hear the difference there, how it just goes from like sounding huge and around your head to just like right up the middle. Yeah, so there you go. There's a easy way to kind of show what that's doing. All right, so that's the stereo width bus. So now we're getting into the actual like tracks and the actual mix itself. So first thing we'll look at is drums, because that's basically where I always start my mixes is with the drums. There's a lot going on here. The first thing I want to call out is I'm using Get Good Drums Invasion for this mix. Now, that is a MIDI VST instrument, right? It's driven from MIDI. It runs in Contact. Let me activate it here so I can pull it up on the screen so you can see it. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with MIDI instruments and especially MIDI drums, because obviously I don't have any drums here, so I can't like actually mic up a drum set, and this isn't a good acoustic studio for drums anyways. So I'm using Get Good Drums Invasion. Now, one thing I decided to do for this mix is something I've been wanting to do for a while, but I just have not had the time. So I figured I'm going to go ahead and make time for this one. And what that is I actually created summing tracks for the kick, for the snare, for each tom, basically every shell. So all the shells, the kick, snare, and the toms. And those are individual summing tracks for each one, which also include overheads routed into it. And then I printed that with some, or before I printed it, I added some EQ to the overheads and then printed that. And I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that. And the reason I did that is because that's going to give me more like true to life, actual live recorded drums. Because when you actually record drums live with a real drummer in a studio with mics, you're going to get mic bleed. You think about where the toms are, the tom mics are placed, like right next to the toms. What's right next to those? The cymbals, right? They're right above it. What's right next to the snare drum? The hi-hat. Like you're going to get the cymbal bleed. You're going to be able to hear some of the toms being played in your overheads and in your snare mics and things like that. So I tried to simulate that bleed for two reasons. One, so that I could practice mixing with that bleed, because that's one thing that I always find is missing from drum instruments like this is like MIDI drums like this, is they're just too perfect, right? Like there's literally no bleed whatsoever. All right, so before I continue rambling on and on, let me just quickly run through and show you the instruments I'm using in Invasion here. So kick I'm using is the Pearl Masters Birch. The snare I'm using is the Ludwig Black Beauty. And then the toms, these are the Yamaha, the low tuned, and you can see all the individual cymbals I've got. I'll just kind of quickly show the settings on the screen. That's the kick, that's the snare, toms, cymbals, and then there's all the individual overheads, rooms, and room close and room far settings. Now, let me give you an example of the sounds that I was talking about as far as mixing some of the overheads in with the actual shells to create that simulated bleed. And you can really hear it on things like my snare and the tom. So I'm going to bypass the plugins that I have here and just play this back. And what you're going to hear is what sounds more like a true to life drummer recording in a studio. You're going to hear cymbal bleed, tom bleed, things like that, the kick bleeding. But then when the snare hits, that's the majority of what you're going to hear during that hit. So let me solo this. Here you go. So there you go. That's an example of what I'm talking about. And then, so that's the top mic. And here is the bottom mic. Oop. Forgot to mute it. Here you go. So that one's much quieter. I've got that pulled back quite a bit because I don't like a lot of bottom mic in my mixes, but you can kind of hear some of the cymbals bleeding there through there as well. So there you go. That's how I kind of put this together so that I could mix this more like a real drummer had recorded it in the studio. So that's what you're going to get in the multi-tracks when you download them. And that is really, really great practice, because if the only thing you're ever used to mixing is MIDI drums, those are perfect. There's literally no bleed whatsoever in your kick, in your snare, in your toms, any of your shells. There's no bleed whatsoever. So you're not getting used to actually mixing a real drummer. So download those multi-tracks, drop them in your DAW, and you're going to hear all of this bleed that you're going to have to practice cutting out. So let's go ahead and back things up, and I'll just start walking through the drums. So this is my actual overall drum bus, and we'll just kind of walk through what's going on in the bus. The very first thing here is this is the Black Salt Audio low control, and I find this super handy on things like the overall drums, my bass, potentially I think I might even have it on the toms as well to kind of tame some of the low rumble, especially in those floor toms. But this is just super quick and easy to use. It has a compressor, which the only thing you have to worry about is the threshold. So you pull this dial up or down to get the level of gain reduction that you want or that you're looking for. And then the compress below, this is anything at this frequency and below is the only thing the compressor is going to affect. So as you can see, I'm only compressing the signal below 90 hertz. The solo low is where you can actually like listen to just this frequency and below, so you can hear what's happening and you can dial in the frequency you want. And then on the enhanced side, this is adding a form of saturation and harmonics to that low frequency, again, that you select here. And the purpose of that is so that the low frequencies translate better on smaller devices or smaller speakers. Think about like a phone or even just like small AirPods kind of headphones, right? The low end will translate better because of that saturation. So I'll just play this back so you can kind of see what's happening and then bypass it so you can try to hear the difference. If you're on small speakers, you'll probably hear some of it. So there you go. I'll play it back again and just kind of crank up the enhanced so you can hear a little bit more what's happening there in the low end. And so there you go. You could really hear how I just got way too much low end. But I tend not to really go kind of above about 10% on this. I've found that is just too much for the stuff that I'm doing here. So that's low control. And again, that's on the overall drum bus, which all of my drums are routed into. Next up is a plugin that I've started using more recently, DrumFlex by DrumForge. And again, this is just a super quick and easy to use plugin, right? So like I don't have to worry about things like attack times, release times, thresholds, all of that stuff. The squeeze here is a compressor. I just dial up the amount that I want or dial it down. And you can see there are a few settings here in this. So I do have this set to bus because this is a bus which all of the drums are routed into. And then the punch and attack and tone, like that's literally it. Of course, there is a mix right here. So you can do like parallel processing, which is what I'm doing. So I'm only blending in 50% of the processed signal with 50% of the original signal. So kind of like a parallel processing. And then it has a built-in clipper, which is this little red line you're seeing here. So anything that hits that is just going to essentially be trimmed off. So any super spiky, harsh transients from the drums are going to get chopped off by this clipper. So I'll just kind of play this back and bypass it so you can hear the difference. Yeah, it really kind of beefs up the drums. And in fact, I'll solo the drums just so you can kind of maybe hear it a little bit better. Yeah, so again, it's not like a huge thing. It's a parallel. It's only 50% of that process signal, but it just kind of adds a little bit of punch and beef to those drums. And then I don't think, yeah. So again, this was just here so that I could kind of see what was happening with some of those plugins that I had in front of this. Again, just kind of like a visual thing. All right. Now, the last thing I'll go over with the drum bus is some of the automation that I've got going on here. And specifically, that's in this middle kind of like break section where it starts to build. Let's solo the drums and just kind of listen to what's happening here, and then I'll walk through it. So there you can hear how like the drum just all of a sudden kind of got super distorted and it kind of faded in to get more and more distorted before it went completely back to normal as it dropped back in. So two things that are happening here is the first thing, let's see, we have the Fab Filter Saturn, you can see right here, which is currently bypassed. And that is because we are outside of the bypass automation. So you can see right here, this is actually the bypass automation itself. So anything in front of where this line drops, the Saturn is bypassed. So then over here is where it's enabled. So it's unbypassed in this section. And then what this is doing below it is it's turning the drive as it starts to get to this part where it builds. So I'm slowly turning up the drive to add more and more saturation to really just crush those drums. And so if you watch, as I play this back again, you'll see this drive slowly turning up, and that's where it's just adding all that saturation and just totally crushing those drums with the distortion. So that is how I did that little trick there. And then continuing on. So the 3 buses that I have here, I'm going to kind of quickly run through these. These are, there's 2 different reverbs and one is for punch. The first reverb is using Verb Suite Classics. The EQ in front of it, again, is just kind of carving out the frequencies that I want. You can ignore these bands here. I was kind of just thought I was hearing something, decided I wasn't. I could probably remove them. And then this is going into, again, Verb Suite Classics. We're using the front room with a 358 millisecond decay, which is not a super long decay. And the reason is because this is actually kind of recreating the sound of an actual like drum room going and the way that I do this is I use a fairly short decay reverb, but follow that up with some fairly heavy compression. So this is typically how I mix my drum rooms anyways, which we'll get to in just a minute. But I figured I want to try and recreate just kind of like a standard drum room with some compression on it to add some decay. So I'll let me see if we can solo this. Okay, we can't. Perfect. So I'll play this back and then I'll mute the compressor just so you can hear the difference in what this is doing. So you can hear how when I mute the compressor, you can still hear that there's a reverb there. It's just, it's a very short decay. So it sounds like almost like it's somewhat of a kind of like a short, like a close room mic almost. But then adding this compressor, which is it's almost 16 dB. So it's quite a bit of compression. It's just extending some of that reverb. Versus just using a reverb that has a long decay. So I kind of prefer this over just like a long decay reverb because this is more controlled. I can dial in how much of it that I want. And I don't think this is doing anything now. This is just, again, just to kind of for graphical so I could see what was happening. This second reverb, drum reverb 2, I could probably rename this to just basically snare verb because this is just something I use on the snare to add some more life, to add some more decay to the snare, make it sound bigger, wider. So that's basically it. So this is using lustrous plates. This comes with my Slate Digital subscription. So this is using just their built-in preset snare verb. And it sounded good out of the box. I didn't touch a single thing. I don't believe I changed a thing. This is just the complete snare verb preset. And then before it, again, I'm just kind of filtering out a lot of the top end and low end just because that just doesn't sound good through a reverb here. And there's no, you can see I've got the townhouse completely bypassed. So this is just kind of like a longer decay reverb, which again, I thought sounded great by itself. So I'll play this back and see if we can solo this. And we should probably only hear the snare. So that is what that bus is doing. And then the last one is drum punch. And this is basically just to add some nice spiky transients in there, but they're parallel processed in, right? Because this is going through a bus. And you can see I'm only blending it back in at negative 29.3. So as I solo this, we'll probably not be able to hear this a whole lot. So what I'm doing here is I'm high passing at 187 hertz, pulling out some of the boxy frequencies around 693, letting some of that high end come through. Then I'm going into the SPL Transient Designer, pulling back some sustain and really boosting the attack. Then we go into the BX Saturator. And this is this is basically a mid-side saturator. And I'm just adding a good bit of this XL, which is the saturation and drive in the mid-high, basically. And then we're compressing it a bit. And then I don't think I'm doing anything. Okay, I am. Cutting off a little bit more of the lows. Again, pulling out some boxiness and then just removing some of this super high sizzle. And then this is what it sounds like. So there you go. That's the punch, right? So it's just adding all transient with some of that saturation on there just to kind of make it nice and kind of crisp and dirty. And this is blended in super low, but it just kind of helps add a little bit of attack to those shells. And that's basically all I put it on, is like the kick and the snare. I don't think it's on it is on the toms just a little bit. All right, so moving on. Now we have the kick sum. And I already showed contact, so I'm actually going to hide this because this was where contact lives and the MIDI mapping. So I'm going to hide this, move it out of the way. And then so this is the kick wave. This comes from Get Good Drums, the Invasion. It's been printed again with some of the overheads blended in to kind of mimic a true true to life like drummer in a studio recording. So I'll play it back without the plug-in here. And then I'll unbypass this and we'll walk through what I'm doing. Let's solo it. So there you go. I mean, this is probably even, if this was a true to life, like actual studio recording, I'd be shocked because I probably could have blended in a little bit more of the overheads here because they're very, very distant and very dull, and some of the recordings that I've had or that I've mixed in the past, that you could still hear quite a bit more like snare and overheads in there as well. But there's some of it in there, so we need to get rid of it. So what I did here is lately I've really been liking the sound of these API console emulations. This one is from Plugin Alliance. It's called the Lindell Plugins 50 series. And so what am I doing here? Well, the very first thing I'm doing is pulling back some of the top end because this is a pretty clicky kick drum. Pulling back just a touch, like 1.5 dB of 8K. I think that's kind of like right around where maybe I was hearing the beater click, so I just pulled that back a little bit. 240, I'm pulling back a little bit. Maybe that was probably some like boxy frequencies. And then pulling back at 40 hertz as well because it also was kind of boomy. And then the next thing I'm going into is probably just a touch of compression. I'm not sure how much gain reduction is happening here. Let me play this back and see. Unbypass. It's very, very, very minor. I can just see the two just barely starting to light up, so it's not doing much at all. But the big thing to call out here is the noise gate. So this is actually what's helping get rid of the cymbal bleed and all of that. And so I really like this noise gate. It does a really good job, and it actually has two different modes. It has gate and expand. And so if you turn off expand, it's just in straight noise gate mode. Expand, and I'm still like trying to wrap my head around exactly what this does. But what I've seen and what you'll see in some of the other tracks is it kind of reacts more to things that aren't necessarily hitting the threshold to activate the gate. It kind of allows a little bit more of the noise to kind of come through, which I feel sounds a little bit more natural versus just like a complete, like when you set it to gate, it's off or it's on and that's it. It's not reacting to anything else. And I see some comments coming in here. Let me see what we've got. Would love one of these with free plugins like Analog Obsession. Yeah, honestly, I have a video that is all 100% stock plugins, so I could potentially do a live stream just kind of like walking through how I did that. I don't think, I'm trying to remember if I think I maybe used a couple Analog Obsession plugins in my Reaper template, but that was also using some paid plugins like Get Good Drums, maybe a couple others I can't remember. Let's see, but cannot beat these paid plugins in my opinion. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'll look into potentially doing one of these with maybe some free plugins in the future. So thank you for that call out. All right, so back to the shells. Yeah, I mean, I definitely could. I just see the new comment. You could talk about the Reaper template. Yeah, I mean, I could definitely do one with the Reaper template, which uses some analog obsession as well as some paid plugins as well. All right, so again, kind of going back to the kick, I'll bypass this. I'll play it with it on, and then bypass it just so you can kind of hear what this noise gate is doing. And again, because the overhead bleed in this kick mic is so low, it's very low, you're gonna have to really listen closely to hear what the gate is doing, but I'll play it back and bypass it. So there you go. You can hear how it really kind of got rid of all that bleed. You can hear a little bit of the snare coming through here, which is because, again, I have this in the expand mode, so it's still kind of reacting to some of those things that aren't necessarily right at the threshold. And I'll give you a better example of what it sounds like with this off as we move forward. And then the other track that I'm using here, the BD kick, this is the Bogren Digital. It's a sample from the Bogren Digital Jens Bogren drum sample pack, and this is just a printed version of that. And it's what I originally was using was the contact instrument that comes with their deluxe pack. And so after I kind of dialed things in, sorry, my headphones are kind of falling off. After I dialed things in, I always print all of this stuff anyways, for a couple reasons. Even if I'm using MIDI drums, I like to print them. And there's two main reasons for that. One, it's for archiving purposes. Say I don't touch this for a year, and maybe there's updates to Get Good Drums or something, or maybe my operating system or Pro Tools or whatever the DAW you might be using, and for whatever reason the session won't open anymore because it's no longer compatible with that older version of Get Good Drums that you are using. So now your session is screwed, you can't open it. So I always print these so that they're just standard WAV files. I have no issue opening it in the future however long I wait, because they're just WAV files. That's the first reason. The second reason is because of phase alignment. And what you'll see here, if we zoom way in, you notice how these are in phase, right? So both of these follow the same waveform curve. That's a good thing. That's what you want. That means there's no phase cancellation. If you print your drums, say you're using samples, with multiple different samples happening, if you print them out and you zoom in like this and you look at these waveforms and you see the opposite, where maybe the first one goes up, but then the one down here goes the opposite direction and goes down, that's phase cancellation. They're canceling each other out. If there's a perfect curve to them, you'll literally hear nothing because they'll completely cancel each other out. Now, the easiest way to demonstrate phase cancellation is I'm going to solo both of these tracks. And on the second one, the Bogren Digital Kick, I'm going to invert the phase or the polarity, and so that's essentially reverting or inverting what the waveform you see here. So now it's the opposite. So now when I play this back, you're still going to hear it, but it's going to sound super thin. There's going to be almost no low end or top end, and it's going to be almost totally mid-rangey. So listen to this, and as I play it back, I'll undo the inversion of the phase, and you'll hear all of it, the low end and all that top end, come back. So that's phase cancellation, and that's the second reason why I like to always print these, so that I can actually look at the waveform and make sure that I'm not running into any phase cancellation. All right, let's zoom back out here. All right, so that's essentially it for the kick drums. You can see this is the Bogren Digital sample that I have here. I'm just kind of pulling back a little bit of the lows, not much else for the EQ, just a little bit of the highs, just a tiny bit of compression, and I don't need the noise gate because there's no bleed in with this sample. So that is the kick. Now, looking at the kick sum, you can see I'm using drum flex here in kick mode. And then I'm using this in parallel mode again. I want to call that out. So it's only 50% of the process signal and 50% of the original signal. You can see I'm employing the clipper here just to kind of help carve off any super harsh transients that may be trying to jump through my mix. And using a clipper or a limiter like this throughout your mix, I would highly encourage, because that's going to reduce the amount of work that, say, like your main leveling compressor on, as I was mentioning, on my main bus, like the Shadow Hills. It's less work that has to do to tame those transients. So that's highly recommended to employ some sort of clipping or limiting. And then you can see that the settings I have here, I'm dialing up the punch, dialing up the attack a little bit, and I didn't touch the tone. So that is drum flex, and then I don't think this is, yeah, again, not doing anything here. This is just so I can kind of see what's going on. That's the kick. And then the snare, I'll actually start with the bus. So this one is using, surprise, drum flex again. And it's almost identical settings, but again, we're in the snare mode. And so we're dialing up the punch, dialing up the attack, the squeeze. We're at 60% this time, so we're sending 60% of the process signal, 40% of the original signal through. Again, employing the clipper to kind of tame any of those harsh transients that may be trying to jump through the mix. And then again, okay, so this one I'm pulling back 17K, just kind of some of that top end sizzle on the snare. And then I have 4 different snare tracks here. And the first 2 come from Get Good Drums Invasion. The first one is the top snare mic. The second one is the bottom snare mic. The third one, again, comes from the Bogren Digital Drum Samples, the Jens Bogren's drum samples. And then the MF snare. The MF doesn't stand for probably what you're thinking it does. It's Middle Farm Studios snare. So this comes from the Middle Farm Studios samples that I found, and this one actually has a decent ring to it that I like, so I blended some of this in. And so what we'll do here is I'm gonna bypass the plugins that I have on the snare top, and then I'm gonna solo this, so you can really hear how I blended in a fair amount of the overheads with this snare when I printed it, so that you get a almost true to life sound to this track, where you get a good amount of cymbal bleed coming through, but you can also hear, obviously, the snare. So let's have a listen to it. And that sounds almost exactly, I mean, honestly, there's probably even more cymbal bleed that comes through in actual real live recorded drums, but I felt like this sounded pretty good, so I just printed it like that. Now, because we have all that bleed and we don't want it, now we have to get rid of it. So again, as I was mentioning before, I've been liking these API emulations on drum shells. So I'm using it again here, just kind of walking through the EQ, not doing anything on the top end, pulling back a little bit of 1.5, and 500 hertz is typically where you're going to find the boxy frequencies and snares. So I'm pulling that back quite a bit, and then boosting up at a 100 hertz just to kind of like add some beef to the snare, some body to it. And then I think I'm maybe getting like maybe 2 dB, maybe 4 of gain reduction. Let me play this back and see what sort of gain reduction we're getting on this compressor. Nope, I was wrong. It's actually between 6 and 8. So it is a fair amount of gain reduction happening already on this. And then the gate. So again, let's play this back. I'll turn off the gate and then I'll turn it on so you can hear the difference. All right, so you can clearly hear how much better that sounds, right? Like it completely got rid of like most of all of that extra cymbal noise. It's coming through a very, very, very tiny little bit. But honestly, I kind of like that because it keeps it sounding more organic, like an actual live drummer, and it's not a perfect, just only a snare hit. And then, so this is actually a great example of demonstrating the differences between gate and expander mode in this particular plugin. So now it's in gate mode because I've turned off expand mode. And the only thing that this is going to react to is if the signal hits the threshold, it will open the gate And if once it crosses the back below the threshold, it closes the gate. That's it. So the only thing we should really hear here is literally just the snare hit. So let's check it out. So yeah, like that's basically all you can hear. You can still hear a very, very, very tiny bit of the cymbals, but that's because I haven't turned this all the way down to kind of really crush the signal when the gate comes on. But I just prefer the expander mode on the snare just because it's still reacting to some of that signal that's not at that gating threshold to kind of keep it sounding a little bit more organic. So I'll play this back again with expander mode on. So you can even see the signal meter kind of starting to go up a little bit when some of those cymbals are hitting, but they're still very, very low, so they're not going to overpower the mix. So that's the snare top, and then the last thing I have on the snare top is the Bogren Digital Labs Transgressor 2. This is a transient designer. The red is the transient, the blue is the sustain. So looking at the knobs at the top, I'm pulling back the transient and boosting the sustain. So I'm going to bypass this, and then I'll unbypass it as it plays so you can really hear the massive difference that this makes. Really pay attention to how when I begin playing this, it's going to just sound like all transient, just a super sharp smack. And then when I unbypass it, how there's less of that smack and more of what sounds like an actual snare drum. So yeah, huge improvement to the snare. So it's now it doesn't just sound like a cardboard box that you're smacking with a stick. It actually has a little bit of ring to it, a little bit of sustain, and sounds like a snare drum. And then there's really not a whole lot to show on the bottom snare. This is essentially the same exact setup. Pulling back boxy frequencies, boosting the low end to get some beef, cutting out the cymbal bleed, and maybe just a tiny bit of compression. And so those two together with the top and the bottom sound like this. There you go. All right, so I just got a question that come through here. Why is the Shadow Hills compressor in dual mono mode? So going back to Shadow Hills. All right, so right here in the middle, you have stereo mode and you have dual mono mode. So stereo mode is essentially going to use whatever settings you have here and apply them evenly across the stereo signal. Whereas dual mono mode is going to essentially use a complete, it's almost like running two different, it's almost like having two instances of the compressor open, and the left and the right are going to be processed with whatever settings you have completely independently. So that it actually reacts to the content on the left and the content on the right as whatever is needed, versus just spreading that same compression across the entire stereo field, basically. So that's the reason I have it in dual mono mode, just to kind of allow the compressor to react to the content on each side, the left and the right, as it needs to. And all right, the last things with the snare drum is the Bogren Digital samples and the Middle Farm samples. So these don't have a whole lot happening here. There's like no EQ. There's just a very tiny bit of compression because these samples just sound good. Okay, with the Middle Farm Studio, again, I'm pulling out some of the 500 hertz boxiness, but that's basically it. So I'll solo both of these together here. So you can hear what those two sound like, and then when we put it all together, all four snare tracks with all the processing, it sounds like this. Sounds huge. All right, moving on to the toms, running through the tom bus here again using drum flex, and this time we're in toms mode. We're sending 50% of the signal through, so parallel again, adding a little bit of squeeze, which is the compressor, and then dialing up the punch and the tack just a little bit. Low control, as I was saying before. This is really good for controlling some of that low-end rumble, especially with floor toms. And there really isn't any floor tom in this except for the very, very end. So we'll see what this is doing down here. I'm just going to play this back. Yeah, you could see I was getting almost like -6 dB on this. But keep in mind, that's only the signal, the frequencies at 75 hertz and below. So that's the only thing that's being compressed there, which is that super low end, almost like sub frequencies from the toms. And then I'm dialing up the enhance at 70 hertz just to kind of allow that low end frequency to translate better on smaller speakers. And then I don't think I'm doing, again, this is just for kind of graphical, just to kind of see what was happening with the signal. Tom 2, Tom 3, and Tom 6, there was no content in this track, so those are just minimized just to kind of move them out of the way. So Tom 3, 4, and 5. And there really isn't a lot happening in the toms here. There's one section here, there's a little part here, and then one part at the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and just bypass these Lindell channel strips and then play this back. It's going to be a ton of cymbal bleed because, again, in a true-to-life, real-world scenario where you're miking up toms from a real drummer, those tom mics are going to be very close in proximity to your cymbals. So there's going to be a ton of cymbal bleed in those tom mics, and so this is how I've kind of simulated that, and this is what it sounds like. So there you go, you could hear that, and that was in the Tom 3 track. So now I'm going to unbypass the Lindell channel strip, and I've already kind of talked through what each of these sections represent. So I'll just put it on the screen so you can look at it. If you have questions, hit the comments and just ask. But I'm going to put it on the screen so you can see what I'm doing, and then I'm going to play it back with this engaged so you can really hear the difference. So there you go. I'm going to just highlight a section here and then loop this so that I can unbypass it and then bypass it again so you can really hear this. Bleed basically gone. And so the way that I did this here is using just the gate mode because the signal was so loud. The bleed from the cymbals and the snare and everything was so loud. If I turned on expander mode to kind of keep the signal sounding a little bit more organic, it was just too much. So like I'll play this back at expander mode. So you can really hear how like when that hi-hat or the cymbal and the snare both hit together, the signal's just too loud and it's still coming through. So I decided just to go with gate mode and just let it just cut all that signal right out. The other way that I would typically tend to mix the snares is during the editing phase, kind of like the mix prep, is I would go through and figure out where all the snare hits are and literally just cut out everything in between there so that the gate doesn't even have to do as much work. And if there's any super harsh, loud transients from like the cymbal or the snare, I don't have to worry about the gate, like trying to dial in the gate perfectly to duck those out. I'm just going to get rid of the content isn't needed. But I left it here for this demo, obviously. And so these other two tracks, I'll pull them up on the screen so you can see the settings. This is the Tom 4. Very similar settings, again, just kind of using the gate to get rid of that bleed. And then Tom 5, exact same thing, basically. And then, so our overall tom sounds like this. So now you're going to hear a bit more bleed as I play this back, because now there's 3 tracks all stacking up on top of each other going into the bus. But it's kind of adding some of that kind of organic bleed through, just to kind of keep things a little bit true to life. And when I unbypass the toms and just you hear the whole mix, like it completely goes away and it just kind of blends in with the whole mix. So there's that, and then now if I unbypass the toms, here's the whole mix again. So you can see how it just kind of all blends in nicely. All right, and then the last of the drums, the hi-hat, which the only section of the hi-hat is during the part when I'm like I'm adding a ton of that saturation to it to kind of really crush the drums. So there really isn't a great way to kind of demo this. The one thing I will call out here is I'm using a bit of a different channel strip plugin here. I think this one's kind of based on a Neve. It's the BX Console N from Plugin Alliance. And the reason I chose this is for a couple reasons. One, it has better filtering. So the filter section up here in the very top left is super, like you can get super precise with this thing. Whereas with the Lindell, you only really have a high pass, and it only high passes up to like 300 or 500 hertz. And it's just this one little dial, and that's basically it. You don't even have a low pass. And then the EQ in this is actually, you can get super precise with this as well. So I can just turn this dial to go to exactly the frequency I want. And then you can even change the Q of it, like the curve, whether you want it wide or sharp. So this is where you can get a lot more precise with things. And that's why I went with the Neve there. And then another trick that I've kind of picked up recently is using the Focusrite 2 equalizer. And the only thing I'm really doing here, I'm pulling back a little bit of the lows, but I'm mainly boosting up the high shelf, and I don't recall what it's at. It's probably at around 8K or so. Just a little bit of a boost. It's at like maybe +4, +5 dB, and it's just got this really sweet top end that it adds to it, and it just sounds really good on a hi-hat. I can't really show it to you because this part right here is super crushed. Let's see. Now you can hear how distorted it is. But I mean, you can hear kind of that top end. It sounds really good. And then the ride, not much to show here. There's like one ride hit in the whole track, but you can quickly see the settings that I have there on the ride. The effects symbols, we'll just kind of play back some of these over here so you can hear it. And then I'll pull the Neve up on the screen so you can see the settings. Nope, let me solo it. So you got, I mean, it just filtering out some of the lows. You can see the settings here. I'm kind of boosting up at around 16K, just a little bit, and then pulling out some of the low frequencies as well. And then we get into the overheads. So I'll solo these real quick. So again, we're going back to the Lindell, and I don't even remember honestly why I have the Lindell on here. I was maybe Actually, I take it back. I do remember now. It's because of the built-in compressor in this. I just liked the way the compressor sounded on these overheads better than the compressor in the Neve. So you can see just pulling back some of the top end. We're using the VCA, and then let me bypass this. See if you see a difference. Yeah, so kind of pulling back a little bit of those transients in the overheads. I don't necessarily need much transient in the overheads. I just kind of want it a little bit more of the punch, and then just kind of that nice airy room sound. So that's the first thing. Pro Q, just kind of clean up a little bit of this. So just pulling back some of the muddy frequencies, pulling back a little bit of the top end here at like 16,000, 16K, just so things don't get too harsh. And then adding Soothe on here with the Cymbal Smooth preset. So I don't know if you can hear that or not, but the Cymbal Smooth, like the delta, just allows you to listen to the difference, like what the frequencies that it's pulling out. So it's just pulling out some of those resonant frequencies. So that is the overheads. And the rooms here. So now we have a rooms summing bus. And the first thing I have here is the SSL bus compressor, and this is going pretty heavily, I think. So let's just take a look. So it's going upwards of just over 12 dB of gain reduction. with a super fast attack, super fast release. Again, I don't need transients in the rooms. I'm just looking for more sustain. And then if we look, I'm blending two different room tracks. So the first one is literally just a kick drum and a snare drum. It's from the Bogren Digital drum samples again, but this is actually just the ambient sample, just the room sample from them. And so I'll play this back and you can kind of hear what those sound like. So there's that, and I've obviously got the snare mixed louder in there so that I can get a little bit more of the sustain from the snare. Like when it hits the compressor, it's going to duck the snare and then allow the sustain to come through. And then the other thing I have is the rooms, which come from Get Good Drums Invasion, and this is what those sound like. So then when you put the samples from Jens Bogren's pack with the GGD samples, essentially, this is what you get. And then let's see, the only really thing I'm doing here is maybe just some EQ. I don't think there's any compression happening. Let's see, Pro Q. So this looks crazy, but this is essentially just pulling out some of those harsh, like resonant frequencies in those rooms, cutting off some of the lows, high pass on our sides, because I don't want those lows coming through the sides. And then overall pulling down the top end quite a bit, around 9-10 dB, because I want the room, like the mid and lowish frequencies to come through for these rooms, but I don't want a lot of the cymbals to come through, because I've got the overhead track where all that high end is going to come from the cymbals. So I don't want that coming from my rooms. It gets to be too much. I see a question. I'll come right back to that. 1 second. And then the last thing is soothe, again, just pulling back some of those harsh resonant frequencies there. And then in the Bogren Digital Room samples, just a little bit of EQ. And I'm actually running it through a little bit of Saturn's warm tape just to kind of add a little bit of saturation to this, kind of add perceived volume and a little bit kind of like a dirty character to it. So that's essentially the processing on the rooms. So that is all of the drums. So I'm going to go ahead and just close that up before we move on to bass. And I see this question: where can I and will I be able to share my version of the mix with full indication of your authorship? Oh yeah, I would love to hear your mix, or anyone else. If any of you download the multi-tracks, which again are in the comments and the description of this video, and mix a copy of it, feel free to share that in the comments of this video when you're done. I will be posting this video. It may not go live immediately on my channel after this video is complete and the live stream ends, but it will be on the channel. So just go ahead and link to your mixes. So whether you upload them to Dropbox or wherever you want to upload it to, if you just want to share a link to that in the comments of this video, I would love to check out any of your mixes that you put together. So great question. All right, so moving on to the bass. And this is going to be kind of a quick one. There's really not a whole lot to go over here. We'll start with the bus. So the very first thing is I'm using Soothe 2. And this is I have this side chained with my kick drum so that whatever the strongest frequency, like the primary frequency of the kick drum in the lower end of the spectrum, as you can see, I'm filtering to 512 hertz. So anything below 512 hertz is the only thing I'm processing here. So like that primary frequency of the kick drum is what is going to be ducked from my bass guitar. And so this is so that I don't run into like the clash between the low end of the kick drum and the low end of the bass guitar, trying to fight for that same low frequency all the time. And then your low end of your mix kind of builds up and just becomes too much. So I'll play this back and you can kind of see what's happening when the kick hits. Think about the kick specifically, and when the kick hits, you're going to see this low end duck here. So there you go. You can see that's ducking those low sub frequencies. I mean, we're down to like around 60 hertz. So like that's that primary low frequency from the kick. And so we're ducking that from the bass guitar here when the kick hits so that we don't get, again, a kind of a buildup of the low frequencies. Then again, I'm using low control here. And as I said before, I don't usually go above 10% on the enhance, and that's what I'm using here. And then let's just kind of play this back and see if we're getting any gain reduction. So just a very little bit. Let me go ahead and solo the bass here, and then I'll bypass this and kind of see if you can hear any of that enhance kind of coming through. So I can, again, with the headphones on, I can clearly hear how when I turn that on, all of a sudden kind of the low end, I can hear it a little bit better because of this, the harmonics that are happening and the saturation that's happening on those low frequencies. So that is low control. And so here we are just kind of pulling out and trying to get rid of some of those low sub frequencies. We're cutting off a high pass at like 29 hertz. And then getting rid of some of the high frequencies above 93K or 9.3K, I guess I should say, and then pulling back some of the upper mids where it was just getting a little bit too harsh and was also clashing with things like the synths and the guitars and the cymbals. So that's just some EQ that's happening here on the bass. In the bus, and then on the individual channels. So what I used to track this with, well, I guess I should say I didn't track this. This is actually a MIDI bass. This was Gin bass, and what I did was I processed, or I wrote out the MIDI lines, which you can see here. So these are the actual MIDI. I then printed that again. Like I said, I print everything. I printed that into this one track here, and then duplicated this. So these are just duplicated. They're the exact same thing. And then I have a bass DI, which is essentially just a low pass at 215 hertz and below to keep those lower frequencies intact because I'm saturating the frequencies above that in the other track. So this is what the DI sounds like, and it's just going to be all the low frequencies. So there you go. There is the low end, and then the opposite of that. You can see I'm at 198 hertz and above is what we're allowing through. And then I'm pulling back some of the lower kind of like muddy frequencies. And then we're going into Neural DSP Dark Glass Ultra. You can see the settings here, and I'm not using an IR. And let's see, a channel strip. I don't even know if I remember why I added this. Let's see if it's doing anything. It doesn't look like it's doing anything except for the low pass. We're just cutting off around 16.2 kilohertz. And I don't remember why I added it. I guess that was just basically the first thing that I saw, or I needed a low pass, and I just went for this one, I guess. And so that is, you just heard it. That's what the top end of this sounds like, the distorted top end of this. And so when we put both of these together with the low DI, with the top distorted, you get this. So there it is. And again, right here, you can see I'm sending the bass to the stereo width bus as I showed earlier. So it's sending a pretty strong signal to this. So I'll play this back and bypass this again for anyone who maybe joined the stream and didn't see that earlier. You can hear how that stereo width bus just kind of really expands the signal all the way around your head. I love that. All right, so that is the bass. Moving on to the guitar. All right, so if you happen to catch one of my more recent videos, the fuzz in modern metal guitar tones, this was the session that I used to demonstrate that with, and I've got a couple of those tracks still here, so we're just going to basically ignore those for now because in the Bogren Digital Audio sample, I hadn't even created those fuzz versions of that, and you can listen to those in that video, which they sound disgusting and it sounds so good. So go check that out. But looking at the guitar's bus, I am not doing literally anything. I'm only sending those into the stereo width bus at about -15 or so. So it's just sending a little bit of that signal into the stereo width. But that's basically it for this bus. And then we have a guitar effects bus here, which I'm using for I think it's the part at the end, but let me see what I'm sending into this guitar effects. I'm not using it, so ignore that. I'm actually not using it. I think I ended up using Nolly's internal effects for some of the guitar parts. So I think this just comes with my template. And so this is the Valhalla Supermassive, which sounds great on guitars. So then moving on to the guitar tracks. And so these were the original tracks in this bus here, but again, I've just kind of printed them, all the DIs together. So we get these here. So these are the main rhythms, the first ones, and these four, I should say. And then this is kind of that ambient part at the end. And then this is just kind of like a final chug just to finish everything up. And so how did I get the tone that you're hearing in those guitar tracks? Let me actually solo the guitar bus here. So this, just kind of quickly running through the signal chain, I start with Fortin Cali Suite. And why am I doing that? Well, it's because this is a 7-string tuned down to G standard, so it's fairly low. There's a lot of low end there. So I knew I wanted something that was going to be able to tighten up that low end. And I usually always reach for the grind for that particular task. So that's what I'm using here is the Fortin grind. Notice the amp and the IR section are off. Then we go into Archetype Nolly. Did I click it? Nope. Let's see, here it is. Archetype Nolly, and the only thing on in this is the amp, and you can see the settings here. Two things I want to point out in this. If you've ever had issues with Archetype Nolly trying to get a good tone, I would highly recommend you do two things. One, pull your master setting down. Do not go above like 4. If you're trying to get like a good heavy chug, thick tone like you hear here, don't go above 4. You can see I have it at about 3.5, 3.6, something like that. And then take your presence knob and basically turn it all the way up and then dial it back to where you think it kind of fits your mix. So those are the two, those are kind of the two tricks that I have found at least work for me. And so that's the amp settings. And then the last thing is so I've actually changed it here. I was playing around with some stuff, but it was actually this side over here for the Bogren Digital audio sample that you heard Bogren Digital share on Instagram and on YouTube. And this was the Christian Cola IRs, but it was the Dark Ribbon Doom and Modern Vocal Standard IRs. So let's just flop this over so you can hear that. And then soloing the guitars, this is what they sound like. Gotta unsolo the bass. And then some of the other parts over here. So that is what the guitars sound like. So that's basically it for the rhythm guitars. Then, let's see, I've got Pro Q here as well. Oh, this is just for the effect part in the middle. So when it goes into that like build part, I'll just solo these. And you can also hear I've automated some pans so that it, like the first 4 chugs are on the left and then the second 4 are on the right, and then it goes together. But that's how I got that sound, is using those EQ settings. And then we have this part here at the end, this kind of ambient part. So let me solo this and just kind of walk through. The only thing I used for this was Archetype Nolly. We have, let's see, what are we using? The Overdrive 2. You can see those settings. And then we're using the second amp and second cab. Yep, we're using the internal cab, the second cab. Let's make sure I'm not lying. Okay, I'm using the Bogren Digital Lead and Clean pack here, and you can see the one that I'm using there. I'm not gonna read it. Names are so stupid. And then you can see the settings on the amp right there. And so the final section is the effects, and we're using the delay and the reverb. They're the settings. I'm not gonna read everything, but this is what this part here sounds like. Could you show, so the question just came in, let's see, could you show how the EQ curve looks at the end of guitar chain? So I'm assuming you mean at the bus, like after everything is done, what does the guitar EQ curve look like in my guitar bus? And again, there's about a 15-second delay, but if that is incorrect, do drop into the comments and let me know, but I will start showing you that. So to show that, I'm just gonna come back to my guitar bus. I'll unbypass this Pro Q here. So I did have some EQ happening in here, but I guess I decided I didn't need this or didn't want it, so I just cut it out. So I'm gonna actually just turn this off because obviously we don't need it. But I'll play these guitar, yes, the bus, okay, perfect. So I'm gonna play this back and you can see exactly what the guitar curve looks like. Let me make sure I'm not, okay, I'm still soloing this part here. And then I'll just kind of go to this chug section here. All right, so if you're unfamiliar with Pro Q3, you can actually monitor external instances of Pro Q3 as well. So that's why you just saw two different things happening there, because I was monitoring the guitars and the bass to make sure there wasn't frequencies clashing. So I'm actually gonna turn this off. Let's see, how do I turn this thing off? External source off, there we go. So now you're just going to see the guitars. So there you go. I hope that was enough and was what you were looking for. Again, hit the comments if there's anything else you want to see there. So with that, I'm gonna just disable that plugin again. All right, so that is the guitar tones. That's it. There was the main rhythm tone, the middle part with the EQ to kind of sound more mid-rangey for the effect, and then the ambient part at the end. So I'm gonna close those up and then move on to the last piece of this mix, which is the synths. I've really been digging synths a lot lately and stuff for both adding ambience, but also for effects, and you're gonna see both of that in this here. And so the two synths, or I guess the three synths that I've been using quite a bit lately, let me activate this and I will show you. So this one is a Contact synth, and this is Analog Dreams. The other one that I've been using a lot is this Ethereal Earth, this one down here on the left. So I just see another comment came in. It says, damn, that is really pretty slight processing on the guitar bus. No low and high cut. Yeah, so I try to keep things as simple as possible. And one thing that I used to do that I no longer do is low passing guitars. I used to do it all the time. I thought a lot of that top end kind of fizziness as I was hearing, you know, like when you solo the guitars or you're just sitting there playing, especially when you take the, you know, the Nolly amp and take the presence and just crank it all the way up, you're like, man, that's so much top end, so fizzy when you're just playing in solo. But when you drop it in a whole mix, it adds it really kind of takes it to that, you know, professional production level, and it just sounds so damn good. So that's the reason I've stopped doing that. I just like the way it sounds. And also when you EQ on your bus like that, after it's already gone through some impulse responses, you're essentially kind of changing things up from the way those impulse responses were kind of designed. And what I mean by that specifically is the Cola IRs, or the Bogren Digital IRs to begin with, are already kind of pre-EQ'd. And obviously those EQs aren't always going to work perfectly for every mix or every session, right? Like those were designed to work with specific sessions, but they already have some EQ in there. And part of that is filtering. If you noticed, I didn't have really hardly any low end coming through those guitars at all. And part of that is because of the IRs, they already have filters applied to them. So I just kind of let those really fantastic IRs just kind of do their thing. Yeah, and it's totally cool. I'm just noticing you said, "Oh, sorry," was a little bit back in the video. It's the delay. Hopefully in the future I'll be able to figure out how to get this delay lower, but there's about a 15-second or so delay. So no worries though. If there's any other questions, please feel free to ask, and I can circle back to whatever. But I'll continue on with the synths now. And like I said, Analog Dreams, Ethereal Earth, and then the Slate Digital Anna 2, which I'll re-enable here just so I can pull it up on the screen and show it to you. Come on. All right, so there it is. That's the Slate Digital Ultra Anna 2 Ultra bundle. And that thing has a ridiculous amount of different sounds. Sound effects and synths and bass drops, 808s, all kinds of stuff. So that's the first synth. So I'm going to disable this again because I've already printed it, as I mentioned before. And then, let's see, make inactive. All right, so down here, I'll solo these one at a time so you can hear what these synths sound like. And I'll just kind of quickly walk through what I'm doing here. So the very first thing is I'm using Black Salt Audio Escalator. This is a saturation plugin, and I've really cranked this up because I just wanted to add some nice dirt and grit to this synth, which also helps with adding harmonics, which helps it cut through the mix a little bit better. And then I'm using Soothe 2 because this particular synth had some kind of resonant, harsh frequencies I didn't like. So that's pulling those out. And then let's see what I'm doing here. Just some filtering and then some dynamic EQ on the top end to kind of pull out some of that super high end. So this is what this synth sounds like. All right, so that's what that synth sounds like. And as you can see, I'm also sending this into a synth verb just to kind of add some room sound to it, some space. And specifically, that is using the Valhalla Supermassive, as you can see there. And so I see some other questions that have just come in, so I'm going to jump to those real quick. David Cho asks, where do you normally high pass and low pass the guitars and bass? So as I was just mentioning, I don't typically high pass or low pass my guitars. The impulse responses that I have been using more recently, those being the Bogren Digital IRs and also the Jeff Dune IRs, which I love. They're fantastic. Both of them, Bogren Digital and Jeff Dune, have the best impulse responses out there. And I have videos on my channel for both of those. So if you search the channel for Jeff Dune or Bogren Digital, you'll find videos on both of those demonstrating the tones. And because of the way that those impulses were designed, they already have enough kind of filtering in them that I didn't have to do any low passing or high passing on my guitars. So I don't do that at all on the guitars. For the bass, I did do it a little bit in the bass bus right here. So you can see this is my bass bus, which has all the bass tracks routed into. So it's kind of like a summing bus. I do have some high pass and low pass happening there. And then let's see, what was the other question? Do you use the multi-band compressor technique anytime, or isn't necessary for you? I don't use multi-band compression like pretty much at all on my guitars. If I'm assuming you're referring to the guitars, I have though in the past. I didn't need it for this particular session. But I have in the past on my guitar bus employed a, let's go ahead and do it here, a low shelf with some dynamic EQ, something like this. So if I play this back, it should show a dynamic kind of ducking here. Yeah. So I have employed that technique in the past, which is similar to a multiband compression, just ducking some of those low frequencies, dynamically, if you will. So I have done that in the past. Let's see, let me unsolo that. Let's see, other question. The guitar sounds heavy, tight, present, with almost nothing processing. It's amazing. Yeah, that's I can't say it enough, honestly, is don't overcook it, right? Like if you kind of know how to dial things in and you're using good impulse responses, which is like 80% or more of your tone is the impulse response, then just let it work for you in your mix, and just make minor changes as needed. No rules for EQing. EQ that to your liking. Yeah, is what Lycan, however you say that said. David Cho, your mix template for Reaper was really helpful. Would you consider doing another one, especially for Reaper with free plugins? Yes, David Cho, you are asking, or you're saying my Reaper mix template was good, and you're asking if I would do another one with only free plugins. I already have plans for early 2022 to do more mix templates. Those are some of the most popular videos on my channel. So yes, I will absolutely be doing more templates, and I can already tell you, I'm planning doing the very next one that I'm planning on doing is a Cubase template, because I've had users emailing me and leaving comments on the other template videos saying, please do Cubase, please do a Cubase template. So I'm going to do a Cubase template, and then I will probably do a Pro Tools template as well, since I already have some kind of in the works. And then I will just kind of see what users are asking for. And I have had users asking for more Reaper templates, so I may circle back and do another Reaper template. But yes is the answer. There will be more templates coming. And I will try to keep some of those with as many free plugins as I possibly can. And then one other note on that is I am planning on doing some more like more premium, if you will, templates where I will use paid plugins and almost kind of like taking this entire mix session and creating a template from it and then putting that out there as well, possibly for sale, possibly selling it, because it does take a good bit of work to kind of put some of this stuff together. So I'm toying with the idea of offering some sort of premium templates that you can potentially purchase, but I don't know. We'll see how it goes. And then, so finishing up this mix walkthrough with the synth. So here is the second synth, and I'll just kind of quickly show you. I'm doing more escalator, just kind of add saturation and harmonics, and a high and a low pass, and that's basically it. And so that's what this one sounds like. I love the way that one sounds. So here, I'll put these first two together so you can hear what just these two sound together. So there's those two. The next one up, the third synth. Again, escalator. We're using soothe here to kind of harsh some resonant frequencies, and probably a high and a low pass. Yep. And so here's what this one sounds like. So there's that one. So if we put all three together, and here is number 4. All right, so now we're getting into kind of the sound effects that I was talking about. So those first 3 were kind of the synths, which add ambience to the first half of this track. Now the second part here, this is where, especially in this break section where it starts to build and then it drops, that's where I'm using kind of the sound effects. So this is the first one, and this is kind of like a siren, if you will. It's kind of it's a build. So we'll just solo this and have a listen to it. Right? So it just kind of builds. You can feel like it's not super loud in the full mix, and I'll play it back once again so you can hear this in the full mix, but it's not super present in the mix, but it's there enough to kind of help with that. You know, it's a riser is what it's called. You can feel it building before it drops. And then the last thing I'll show is this loud hit, like almost like explosion sound when it drops in, and this is what it sounds like. right? Like big explosion when it drops. So when you put those two sound effects together, this is what you get. Right, so it builds and then bam, it drops. So again, here is the full session in this riser part, right? And then you can really hear when it drops in. So you can really hear that there, and it's almost like something you can you feel in the mix as well, because it's not like super present. But here's what happened. Check this out. I'm gonna mute both of those, the riser and that explosion, and listen to how it doesn't build and drop as much as when they're there. So it's a night and day difference, you know, sound effects like that, like that's the production element of putting stuff together. So stuff like that I've been super into lately. That's the session. That's it. That is everything, y'all. I hope this was helpful. I'm just going to take another quick glance at the comments and see if there's anything else here. Let's see, David shows, yes, you do template sales. So many guys are selling templates. Okay, well then, you know, if there's others selling templates, then I'll probably start selling some of these premium ones. See, David show, what audio interface, monitors, headphones, and PC specs are you using for your audio production? So I'll start at the top, audio interface. I've primarily been using my Neural DSP Quad Cortex as my audio interface. Before that, I was using a Focusrite Scarlett 8i8. Or something like that. It's like a 3rd gen Focusrite Scarlett. Monitors. I'm using JBL monitors here. I have a video on the channel. I think it was like a studio tour. You can see those specifically there. Let's see where to go. Monitors, headphones. I don't use much headphones in my mixes, but these ones are the Audio-Technica A50 something or others. They're really, really good, and I tend to just kind of put them on at the end of the mixes just to kind of check and make sure things sound good on headphones. I'm using a Mac Pro. It's a 2013 Mac Pro, so it's really old at this point, but it's a 12 core with 64 gigs of memory, so it's been serving me well. Let's see, do you make... That's basically it. I would buy custom-made templates. Awesome. Well, then, like I said, I'll probably start putting some of those together. Great idea in the custom templates, dude. If you make a Patreon account, I'll be there. I mix with aborted media. Oh, wow. Yeah, so something I had been considering is creating a Patreon account. And I think I'm going to start doing this once a month, where I put together a session, provide the multi-tracks, allow y'all to mix it yourself, and then we'll walk through it live in how I mixed it. And that might be something that moves to a Patreon account in the future. The synths are awesome. Late to the party, but glad to join. Yeah, thanks for jumping in. Are there any riser effects in wave format that's usable? Yes, there are different. I think Joey Sturgis Tones actually has different production packs with those risers and effects in it. 2014 Mac is still working good. Yeah, it's been holding up so far. M50X, yeah, I think those are the headphones. Yeah. All right, so that's it, y'all. We've been going almost 2 hours now. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this live stream. Listen, I super appreciate y'all hanging out with me and walking through this. I hope this was helpful to you. And with that, thank you so much for joining.